Low, serious tone with building intensity. What would you sacrifice for financial security? Your time, your principles, your soul. I thought I was just accepting a strange man's gold coins. I never imagined I'd return home to find my daughter's laughter silenced, my wife's eyes empty, and our family photos slowly erasing me from existence. The coins brought wealth beyond my dreams. But each night I'd catch glimpses of my family trapped in mirrors and reflections, hollow versions of themselves fading away as the price for my greed. Now I have one coin left, and a devil's bargain. I can save them, but only by taking their place in that nightmare reflection world. What would you sacrifice to undo your greatest mistake? Because when the stranger offers you the devil's gold, he doesn't tell you that the true cost isn't measured in coins. It's measured in heartbeats, in I love yous, in the faces of those who matter most, and by the time you realize it, they're already gone. Thomas Mercer never thought of himself as a desperate man. He had always believed that hard work and perseverance would eventually pay dividends. Yet at 42, sitting at his kitchen table, with bills spread before him like fallen autumn leaves, that belief was wearing thin. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the room, illuminating the dust particles that danced in the air, suspended and directionless. Much like Thomas himself, his fingers traced the edge of an overdue mortgage notice, the paper worn from being folded and unfolded countless times. Outside, he could hear his daughter Ellie's laughter mingling with the neighborhood children's voices, a sound that both warmed his heart and tightened the knot in his stomach. His wife, Rebecca, moved around the kitchen preparing dinner, humming softly to herself. Thomas watched her, marveling at her ability to maintain optimism despite their circumstances. "You're staring again," Rebecca said without turning around, a smile in her voice. "Just thinking how lucky I am," Thomas replied, quickly shuffling the bills into a stack and sliding them into a drawer. The drawer had become his repository of shame. Medical bills from Ellie's asthma treatments, credit card statements with balances that never seemed to decrease. And now the mortgage warning. Rebecca placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. Her touch still sent a current through him, even after 15 years of marriage. "Something will come up, Tom, it always does." But something hadn't come up for months now. Thomas's construction company had gone under after his business partner embezzled funds, leaving Thomas with debts and a tarnished reputation. The jobs he managed to find were sporadic and paid far less than what they needed. That night, after Rebecca and Ellie had gone to bed, Thomas sat alone in the living room, a glass of cheap whiskey in his hand. On the mantelpiece stood family photographs, Rebecca holding newborn Ellie, all three of them at the beach last summer, his parents at their 50th anniversary. His father had given him an old pocket watch that night, a family heirloom passed down through generations. "Time is the only true wealth," his father had said. Thomas now held the watch, its weight familiar and comforting in his palm. The inscription inside read, "To measure moments, not money." As he ran his thumb over the worn silver surface, a strange thought occurred to him. What if he could trade time for money? How many moments would he sacrifice to secure his family's future? Sleep evaded him, and Thomas found himself walking to the small pond at the neighborhood park around midnight. The water was still, a perfect mirror reflecting the full moon. He skipped a stone across the surface, watching the ripples disrupt the image. 5 skips. As a boy, he'd never managed more than 3. His father had been able to make stones skip 7, sometimes 8 times. "Impressive," a voice said from behind him. Thomas turned, startled. He hadn't heard anyone approach. A man stood there, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit despite the late hour. He appeared to be in his 60s, with silver hair and unnaturally bright eyes that seemed to reflect the moonlight too perfectly. "Sorry to disturb your solitude," the man said, his voice smooth and cultured. "Insomnia brings us all to strange places," Thomas nodded, uncomfortable yet curious. "Do you live around here?" "I don't think I've seen you before," the man smiled, showing teeth too white and even. "I'm just passing through." I have a knack for finding people at crossroads. He extended his hand. Charles Fielding. Thomas shook it, surprised by the coldness of the man's grip. Thomas Mercer. I know, Charles replied, releasing his hand. I make it my business to know about people like you, Thomas. People with potential who've been dealt an unfair hand. A chill ran down Thomas's spine that had nothing to do with the night air. What exactly do you want? Charles Fielding gestured to the bench nearby. Let's sit. I have a proposition that might interest a man in your position. The park bench felt unnaturally hard beneath Thomas, as if the wood had turned to stone. Charles Fielding sat beside him, an appropriate distance away, yet somehow too close. The stranger's cologne smelled of expensive spices and something else, something Thomas couldn't quite place. Metallic and ancient. I've been watching you. Mr. Mercer, Charles said, his eyes fixed on the still water of the pond. A hard-working man, devoted to his family, brought low by the dishonesty of others. He turned to face Thomas. How does that feel? To do everything right and still lose? Thomas swallowed hard. I haven't lost yet, Charles smiled. That's precisely why I'm here. That resilience, that refusal to accept defeat, it's rare. What do you want from me? Thomas asked again, an edge of impatience cutting through his unease. From an inner pocket of his immaculate suit, Charles produced a small velvet pouch, drawing it out with the theatrical flourish of a magician. He loosened the drawstring and tipped the contents into his palm. 5 gold coins gleamed in the moonlight, each the size of a quarter, but thicker. Even in the dim light, Thomas could see they were unusual, marked with symbols he didn't recognize. The edges irregular, as if hand-struck, what people have called by many names throughout history, Charles said softly. The devil's gold, Lucifer's coins, Mephistopheles' payment. But these are just superstitions. I prefer to think of it as opportunity in tangible form. Thomas stared at the coins. They seemed to pulse with their own inner light, warm and inviting. I don't understand. It's quite simple, Charles continued. These 5 coins will give you what you need. Each one spent will bring wealth, but also take something in return. A transaction fair and balanced. He held out his hand, offering the coins to Thomas. The choice is entirely yours. No contracts, no signatures in blood. Those are the fabrications of unimaginative minds. Just intent and action. Thomas didn't reach for the coins. What's the catch? What do they take? Charles closed his fingers around the coins. That depends on what you value. The coins have a way of knowing. Some say they take memories. Others claim time or luck or love. I can't tell you exactly what they'll cost you, Thomas. I'm merely the messenger. Why would anyone accept such an offer? Because the immediate need outweighs the distant cost. Charles's eyes softened with what appeared to be genuine sympathy. When your daughter's medication runs out next week, when the bank finally loses patience, when your wife's faith in you begins to waver, what will those abstract concerns matter then? Thomas felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead. He hadn't told anyone about Ellie's medication running low. How do you know these things? I told you. I make it my business to know. Charles stood, dropping the velvet pouch onto the bench between them. Take it or don't. But don't pretend you haven't been looking for exactly this kind of miracle. Thomas stared at the pouch. And if I refuse? Then I find someone else who needs a miracle, Charles said simply. There's never a shortage of desperate people. But I would be disappointed. I chose you specifically, Thomas. I believe you'll use these wisely. He straightened his tie. I'll be seeing you again, regardless of your decision. Before Thomas could respond, Charles Fielding walked away, his figure quickly swallowed by the darkness beyond the reach of the park lamps. Thomas sat alone, the velvet pouch heavy with possibility beside him. He should leave it, he knew that. Nothing good could come from such an offer. Yet his hand moved of its own accord, fingers closing around the soft fabric. He could feel the coins inside, warm through the material, as if they'd absorbed Charles's body heat. Or perhaps they generated their own. The walk home seemed both eternal and instantaneous. Thomas found himself at his front door without memory of the journey, the pouch tucked securely in his jacket pocket. Inside, the house was quiet except for the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Another family heirloom, one they hadn't yet been forced to sell. In the bathroom, Thomas emptied the pouch onto the counter. The 5 gold coins clinked softly against the porcelain, gleaming even in the dim light. He touched one cautiously, half expecting it to burn his finger. It felt warm, but not uncomfortably so. He picked it up, studying the strange markings, symbols that seemed almost familiar, yet impossible to identify. His reflection in the mirror looked haggard, eyes shadowed with worry. Behind him on the wall hung a small framed photograph of Rebecca, holding newborn Ellie. It was his favorite image, his entire world contained. In one perfect moment, Thomas slipped the coins back into the pouch and hid it in his sock drawer. He would think about it tomorrow. He would make a rational decision in the daylight. But as he lay beside Rebecca, listening to her even breathing, the thought of the coins burned in his mind like a fever. Just 5 coins. 5 chances to fix everything. What was there to lose that he wasn't already at risk of losing anyway? Morning arrived with deceptive brightness. Thomas woke to find Rebecca already up, preparing breakfast. Ellie sat at the table, drawing intricate patterns on a sheet of paper. Her small fingers worked methodically, creating shapes that reminded Thomas, unsettlingly, of the symbols on the gold coins. "Sleep well?" Rebecca asked, setting a cup of coffee before him. "Well enough," Thomas lied, accepting the mug gratefully. The weight of the hidden pouch seemed to pull at him from upstairs, a gravitational force he couldn't ignore. As he drove Ellie to school, she chatted about an upcoming science project. Thomas nodded at appropriate intervals, his mind elsewhere. At the school gate, he hugged her tightly, inhaling the scent of her strawberry shampoo. "Everything okay, Daddy?" she asked, her eyes, so like Rebecca's, searching his face. "Everything's perfect, sweetheart," he assured her, forcing a smile. "Have a great day." Instead of heading to his latest construction job, Thomas drove to the bank. The velvet pouch sat on the passenger seat like a silent companion. 1 coin, he had decided. He would try just one and see what happened. If Charles Fielding was simply insane, Thomas would be no worse off. And if he wasn't, the bank was nearly empty at this early hour. A single teller greeted him with professional courtesy. Thomas approached, heart pounding. "I'd like to exchange this for cash," he said, placing 1 gold coin on the counter. His fingers lingered on it for a moment, reluctant to break contact. The teller examined the coin with interest. "This is unusual. Where did you get it?" "Family heirloom," Thomas said, the lie coming easily. "My grandfather collected rare coins." She turned it over in her fingers. "I'm not an expert, but this looks valuable. Let me check with our manager." As she walked away, Thomas felt a momentary panic. What if they confiscated it? What if they asked questions he couldn't answer? But the manager, an older man with wire-rimmed glasses, merely studied the coin with academic interest. "This is quite extraordinary," he said after a moment. "It appears to be a very old Spanish doubloon, though the markings are unusual. We can certainly exchange it, but you might get more from a collector or auction house." "I'd prefer cash today," Thomas insisted. The manager nodded. "As you wish. I'll need to make some calls to determine a fair value." Thomas waited, his anxiety building with each passing minute. Finally, the manager returned. "Based on weight and apparent authenticity, we can offer you $15,000. Is that acceptable?" Thomas stared at him, certain he'd misheard. The coin couldn't possibly be worth so much. Yet the manager was already preparing paperwork, treating the transaction as routine. 30 minutes later, Thomas left the bank with more cash than he'd held in years. The money felt almost unreal in his hands, as if it might turn to leaves or dust at any moment. He paid several bills immediately, then drove to the pharmacy to refill Ellie's prescriptions. With each transaction, he waited for some terrible consequence. But none came. That evening, he presented Rebecca with the remainder of the money, claiming he'd received payment for a job he'd completed months ago. "This is wonderful, Tom," she exclaimed, embracing him. "I knew things would turn around." As they celebrated with a proper dinner, for the first time in months, Thomas felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The gold had worked. Whatever price Charles Fielding had spoken of, It seemed distant and abstract compared to the relief of seeing Rebecca smile without strain, of knowing Ellie's medication was secured. Later that night, as Thomas stood brushing his teeth, he noticed something odd in the mirror. The family photograph that had hung behind him was changed. Rebecca still held Ellie, but Thomas, who'd been standing beside them with his arm around his wife, was no longer in the image. It was as if he'd been carefully edited out, the composition adjusted to make his absence unremarkable. He turned to examine the actual photograph, heart racing. There he was, exactly where he should be. He looked back at the mirror, and in its reflection, the photograph showed only Rebecca and Ellie. Thomas closed his eyes, counting to 10. When he opened them, the mirror reflected the photograph correctly, with all three of them present. He must have imagined it, stress and guilt playing tricks on his perception, but that night he dreamed of the pond. In the dream, he skipped stones, but each one sank immediately, creating ripples that grew until they became waves, threatening to overflow the banks. Charles Fielding stood watching, his smile widening impossibly until it split his face in two. Thomas woke gasping, his pillow soaked with sweat. Beside him, Rebecca slept peacefully, unaware of his distress. The dream faded quickly, leaving only a vague unease and a persistent thought. 4 coins remained in the velvet pouch. 4 more chances to change their lives completely. The second coin vanished into the system of a luxury car dealership. Thomas hadn't planned to spend it so soon, but 2 weeks after the bank transaction, the construction company that had been giving him occasional work closed down. The stress returned immediately, gnawing at his insides, despite the remaining money from the first coin. The gold performed its magic again. The salesman accepted it as a rare collector's item worth far more than its size suggested, and Thomas drove home in a black SUV that smelled of leather and privilege. He told Rebecca it was a company car, provided for his new position with a development firm, another lie that slipped from his lips with disturbing ease. That night, he found Ellie in the bathroom, staring at her reflection with a puzzled expression. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" he asked, kneeling beside her. "My freckles are gone," she said, pointing to her nose. "See?" Thomas examined her face. The light dusting of freckles that had adorned her nose and cheeks since she was a toddler had indeed vanished. "Maybe they're just fading because it's winter," he suggested, though he felt a cold certainty that this was not the case. "I liked them," Ellie said quietly. "They were like Mommy's." Thomas looked at his daughter more carefully then. There was something else different about her, something he couldn't quite identify. Her eyes seemed a shade darker, her hair slightly straighter, subtle changes that no one else would notice. But to a father, they were jarring discordances in the familiar melody of his child's appearance. The third coin went toward paying off their mortgage entirely. The bank officer had raised her eyebrows at the unexpected windfall, but processed the payment without question. Thomas was learning that people rarely questioned good fortune that didn't directly affect them. Rebecca was ecstatic, though her celebration was tempered with confusion. "How is this possible, Tom?" she asked as they toasted with champagne neither of them had particularly wanted. 3 months ago, we were discussing bankruptcy. Investments I made years ago, Thomas explained vaguely. They finally paid off. Rebecca studied him, her head slightly tilted. Thomas had the distinct impression she was looking for something in his face that she couldn't find. "You've changed," she finally said. "For the better, I hope," he replied with a smile that felt stretched across his face. "I'm not sure," Rebecca said softly, setting down her glass. "You're—" sharper somehow, colder. That night, Thomas examined himself in the bathroom mirror. His reflection showed a man more confident, more polished than the Thomas Mercer of 3 months ago. His shoulders seemed broader, his jawline more defined, his eyes harder. Success suited him physically, it seemed, even as it hollowed him from within. The family photograph now showed subtle alterations in the mirror's reflection. Thomas was still absent, but Rebecca and Ellie had changed as well. Their smiles seemed fixed and artificial, their eyes lacking the warmth he remembered capturing in that moment. Thomas's father's pocket watch had stopped working. No matter how carefully he wound it, the hands remained frozen at 3:17. The inscription inside had changed too, now reading simply, "Moments measured." The fourth coin disappeared into an investment account that immediately flourished, expanding Thomas's new fortune exponentially. He quit looking for construction work entirely, telling Rebecca he was now a consultant, working from home most days. In reality, he spent hours staring at his computer screen, watching numbers grow while feeling something within himself diminish. Ellie began having nightmares. Thomas would wake to her screams, racing to her bedroom to find her sitting upright, eyes wide and unseeing. "The gold man," she whispered one night as Thomas held her. "He watches me through the window." Thomas's blood ran cold. "What gold man, Ellie?" "The one who's taking everything away," she said, her voice distant. "He says soon he'll take me too." Thomas stayed in her room that night, watching the windows until dawn broke. No figure appeared, but he couldn't shake the feeling of being observed, evaluated, measured for worth. The final coin remained in its velvet pouch, now hidden in a safe in Thomas's home office. He had resolved not to use it, to be content with what the first four had provided. They had more than enough now: financial security, luxury, status. The neighbors who had once looked at them with pity now regarded them with envy and respect. Yet the changes continued. Rebecca grew distant, her affection seeming programmed rather than genuine. Ellie's asthma disappeared completely, but so did her boisterous laughter and curious questions. Both seemed to be fading in some fundamental way, becoming less themselves with each passing day. Thomas began to notice other alterations. Family photographs throughout the house showed subtle differences in the mirror's reflection versus reality. In reflections, backgrounds changed, expressions altered. Sometimes people disappeared entirely. The grandfather clock in the hallway ran backwards when viewed in the mirror, though its chimes still marked the hours in normal progression. Water began to feature prominently in his dreams: rising floods, bottomless lakes, torrential rain that dissolved everything it touched. Each morning, Thomas woke with the taste of pond water in his mouth, stagnant and mineral-rich. Then came the morning when he woke to find Rebecca's side of the bed empty. This wasn't unusual. She often rose before him, but when he went downstairs, she wasn't there. Ellie's bedroom was similarly vacant, her bed neatly made, as if she hadn't slept in it. "Rebecca," he called. "Ellie?" The house answered with silence. Their cars were still in the garage. Rebecca's purse sat on the kitchen counter. Ellie's backpack hung from its usual hook by the door, but no sign remained of their actual presence. No half-finished coffee, no dropped socks, none of the detritus of human existence. Thomas searched the house frantically, then the yard, then the neighborhood. He called Rebecca's friends, Ellie's school. No one had seen them. No one seemed particularly concerned by their absence, as if Thomas's mild worry was an overreaction to a perfectly normal situation. By evening, desperate and terrified, Thomas found himself back at the pond where he had first met Charles Fielding. The water was perfectly still, reflecting the emerging stars like a black mirror. Thomas reached into his pocket, clutching his father's stopped watch like a talisman. "I know you're here," he called into the darkness. "Bring them back." Charles Fielding emerged from the shadows as if he'd been waiting for this moment. His suit was different, midnight blue now instead of charcoal, but otherwise he appeared unchanged. "Bring who back, Thomas?" he asked, his voice mild with feigned confusion. "My family," Thomas said, his voice breaking. "What have you done with them?" Charles smiled sadly. "I've done nothing. The coins take what they will. I told you there would be a price. You said they might take memories or time," Thomas protested. "Not people. Not my entire family. Did I?" Charles looked genuinely thoughtful. "Perhaps that's what you needed to hear to accept the offer. We often mishear what we don't wish to understand." Thomas lunged forward, grabbing Charles by his immaculate lapels. "Bring them back!" Charles didn't resist the assault, but neither did he seem affected by it. His body felt oddly insubstantial beneath Thomas's hands, as if he were gripping a suit filled with smoke. "I can't bring back what was freely traded," Charles said calmly. "But you still have one coin, don't you? Perhaps that might open a way." Thomas released Charles, stepping back. "The last coin? That's your solution?" "It's a solution," Charles corrected, "though perhaps not the one you're hoping for. What would happen if I used it?" Charles adjusted his cuffs, unruffled by Thomas's aggression. "The fifth coin is different from the others. It doesn't bring, it returns. It doesn't create, it restores. But only if used correctly." "And how do I use it correctly?" Thomas demanded. Charles smiled, an expression that never reached his unnaturally bright eyes. "That, I'm afraid, you must determine for yourself. Intent matters with the fifth coin more than with the others." He gestured toward the pond. "Look into the water, Thomas. See what has become of your world." Thomas approached the pond's edge reluctantly. The water's surface was now perfectly still, reflective as a mirror, despite the light breeze. As he gazed into it, Thomas saw not his own reflection, but a scene from his home. Rebecca and Ellie sitting at the dining table eating dinner in silence. Their movements were mechanical, their faces devoid of expression. A third figure sat with them, a man who resembled Thomas but was subtly wrong, his posture too rigid, his gestures too precise. "What is this?" Thomas whispered. "The life you purchased," Charles replied, standing beside him. "Your family continues to exist after a fashion. They simply exist in a world where you spent all 5 coins, without hesitation or regret, where you valued wealth over connection. In that world, you have everything and nothing simultaneously." The scene shifted, showing Rebecca lying in bed, staring at the ceiling with vacant eyes. The Thomas-like figure moved around the room, checking stock prices on his phone, entirely oblivious to his wife's emptiness. "They're hollow," Thomas said, horrified. "Just shells." "Precisely," Charles agreed. "The coins take essence first, the intangible qualities that make people who they are. Love, compassion, curiosity, joy. The physical form remains longest, though eventually that too will fade." The pond's surface rippled, and the image dissolved. Thomas turned to face Charles, who was regarding him with clinical interest. "Why did you choose me?" Thomas asked. "What made me special?" "Special?" Charles laughed softly. "Oh, Thomas, you weren't special. You were typical. A good man ground down by circumstances until he was willing to rationalize a terrible bargain." His expression softened slightly. "Though I will admit, you've surprised me by stopping at 4 coins. Most use all 5 without hesitation." Thomas felt sick. "All those people. Their families are in reflections now," Charles finished. "Accessible only through mirrors, water, any reflecting surface. Always visible, never reachable, unless I use the 5th coin correctly," Thomas completed. He straightened his shoulders. "Tell me how." Charles shook his head. "I cannot. The nature of the transaction prevents me from offering such direct guidance. But I will say this. Consider carefully what you've learned about value since we first met." With that cryptic advice, Charles turned and began walking away. "Wait!" Thomas called after him. "Will I see you again?" Charles paused but didn't turn around. "That depends entirely on your next choice, Thomas Mercer. Choose poorly, and you'll become me, offering coins to desperate souls. Choose wisely, and we'll never meet again." He continued walking, his figure blending into the darkness until Thomas could no longer distinguish him from the night. At home, Thomas went straight to his office safe. The velvet pouch sat where he had left it, containing the single remaining coin. He emptied it into his palm, studying the strange symbols that now seemed almost legible to him, as if he'd been learning an alien language through osmosis. The house felt cavernous and empty. Thomas wandered from room to room, touching Rebecca's things, Ellie's toys, searching for some residual warmth, some echo of their presence. In Ellie's room, he found her favorite stuffed rabbit sitting on her perfectly made bed. Thomas had given it to her when she was 3, and its ear was worn thin from years of being clutched during asthma attacks and nightmares. in his and Rebecca's bedroom. He found her wedding ring on the nightstand. Rebecca never removed it, not even to shower or sleep. Seeing it there, abandoned, broke something in Thomas that had been barely holding together. He sat on the edge of the bed, the coin in one hand, the ring in the other. If Charles was to be believed, his family existed in some mirror world, fading versions of themselves, living with a fading version of him. Thomas tried to imagine that other Thomas, the one who had used all 5 coins without remorse. Was he happy with his hollow family and his meaningless wealth? Or did some part of him sense the emptiness of his existence? Thomas slipped the coin into his pocket and made his way to the bathroom. Standing before the mirror, he stared hard at his reflection, searching for signs of the other Thomas. The man who looked back at him seemed both familiar and foreign, his features harder, his eyes colder, his mouth set in a perpetual slight frown. "What do I do?" Thomas asked his reflection. "How do I bring them back?" His reflection offered no answer. Thomas turned away, frustrated. As he did, he caught a glimpse of movement in the mirror that didn't correspond to his own. He whipped back around, but the mirror showed only him, standing alone in the bathroom. Thomas's gaze fell on the family photograph hanging on the wall. In reality, it showed all 3 of them, Thomas, Rebecca, and Ellie, smiling on that beach day. But in the mirror's reflection, Thomas saw only Rebecca and Ellie, their smiles fixed and artificial, their eyes empty. An idea began to form. If his family was trapped in reflections, perhaps the way to reach them was through a reflection. Thomas retrieved the coin from his pocket and held it up before the mirror. In the reflection, the coin glowed with an inner light that wasn't visible in reality. "I want my family back," Thomas said to his reflection. "Whatever it costs me." He pressed the coin against the mirror's surface. To his astonishment, instead of meeting cold resistance, the coin sank into the glass as if it were water. Ripples spread outward from the point of contact, distorting his reflection. For a moment, nothing else happened. Then the mirror's surface began to swirl, colors and shapes blending together like paint in water. When it cleared, Thomas was looking not at his bathroom, but at his living room, where Rebecca sat reading and Ellie played with her stuffed rabbit. They looked solid, real, alive, but they were clearly on the other side of the mirror, in some parallel version of his home. Thomas placed his hand against the mirror. The surface felt cool but yielding, like thick gelatin. He pushed harder, and his hand sank through, emerging into the space he could see beyond. The air on the other side felt different, heavier, charged with an electric potential that made his skin prickle. Taking a deep breath, Thomas stepped fully into the mirror. Crossing through the mirror felt like moving through heavy water. For a brief, terrifying moment, Thomas couldn't breathe, his lungs refusing to function in this in-between space. Then he broke through, gasping, into what appeared to be his living room, but wasn't quite right. The colors were muted, the edges of furniture slightly blurred, as if everything existed in a permanent state of slight unfocus. Rebecca looked up from her book, her expression shifting from surprise to something like recognition, then to wariness. "Tom," she said, her voice distant despite her being only a few feet away. "You're different." Ellie clutched her rabbit tighter, shrinking back into the couch. "You're not Daddy," she whispered. "You look like him, but you're not him." Thomas took a step toward them, then stopped when both flinched slightly. "It's me," he said urgently. "The real me, not the other one." Rebecca's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" "There is no other you." "There is," Thomas insisted. "The man who lives here with you, who looks like me, he's not me. He's what I became when I accepted the devil's gold, a hollow version of myself." He pulled out his father's pocket watch. "Look, the watch has stopped." "It never stops in the real world." Rebecca examined the watch without touching it.
"Tom's watch works fine," she said slowly.
"It keeps perfect time, because it's not the real watch," Thomas said. "Nothing here is real, not completely. We're in some kind of reflection, a mirror world created by the gold." Ellie had been studying him intently. Now she spoke, her voice small but certain. "He has freckles, Mommy, like yours." "Daddy doesn't have freckles anymore." Thomas touched his face in surprise. He hadn't had freckles since childhood, when they had faded naturally. But Ellie was right. He could feel slight texture differences where freckles must now mark his skin. "The coins changed me," he explained. "They changed all of us. But I only used 4. The other Thomas, the one who lives here with you, he used all 5. He traded away everything that mattered for wealth and status." Rebecca stood, placing herself protectively in front of Ellie. "If what you're saying is true, then what do you want from us?" "Why are you here?" "To bring you home," Thomas said simply. "Back to the real world." "And how exactly do you plan to do that?" A familiar voice asked from behind him. Thomas turned to find Charles Fielding standing in the doorway to the dining room, immaculate as ever in his midnight blue suit. "You said the 5th coin could restore what was lost," Thomas said. "I've brought it to them." He pulled the coin from his pocket, holding it up. In this reflected world, it glowed visibly with an inner golden light. Charles smiled, inclining his head. "So you have. But did I say the restoration would be what you expect?" "The 5th coin restores balance, Thomas. It doesn't undo transactions." "What does that mean?" Thomas demanded. "It means you have a choice," Charles said, moving into the room with fluid grace. "The 5th coin can indeed free your family from this reflection, but someone must remain to maintain the balance. A soul for a soul, as it were." Thomas felt cold realization wash over him. "I would have to stay." "Precisely," Charles confirmed. "You would take their place in this fading reflection while they return to the real world. Eventually, this reflected reality will dissolve completely, taking you with it." He glanced around the room with distaste. "It's not a pleasant fate, I assure you." "And the other Thomas?" Thomas asked. "What happens to him?" "He too will fade," Charles said. "He is, after all, merely a reflection of your worst impulses, given form by your choices." Rebecca had been listening intently. Now she stepped forward. "If what you're saying is true, and I'm not convinced it is, why would this Thomas sacrifice himself for us? The Thomas I know now wouldn't give up $1 to save a drowning man." "Because I'm not him," Thomas said quietly. "I'm the man who married you 15 years ago. The man who sat up all night when Ellie had pneumonia when she was 4. The man who still carries your father's fishing lure in his wallet because it was the first gift you ever gave me." He pulled out his wallet and extracted a small, tarnished fishing lure. Rebecca's eyes widened. "Tom got rid of that years ago. Said it was sentimental nonsense." "I would never say that," Thomas said softly. "Some things are worth more than their material value." Ellie approached cautiously, studying Thomas's face. "Your eyes are different," she observed. "They look sad. Daddy's eyes are always cold now." Thomas knelt to her level. "I'm sad, sweetheart. I made a terrible mistake, and it cost me the 2 people I love most in the world. But I'm going to fix it if I can." He rose and faced Charles. "If I give them the coin, they go free and I stay here?" "That is correct," Charles confirmed. "Though I should warn you, the transaction requires absolute certainty. Any hesitation, any regret, and it will fail." Thomas nodded, then turned back to Rebecca and Ellie. "I need you to trust me," he said. "When I give you this coin, hold it together and think of home, our real home, the way it was before all this happened." "Can you do that?" Rebecca hesitated, then nodded slowly. "If what you're saying is true, yes." She took Ellie's hand. "We can do that." Thomas held out the coin. "Then take it, and know that I love you both more than anything in this world or any other." Rebecca reached for the coin, but before her fingers could touch it, the front door burst open. A figure identical to Thomas stormed in. The other Thomas, the reflection. His face was contorted with rage, his movements jerky and unnatural. "Get away from them," he shouted. "They're mine. Everything here is mine." Charles sighed. The complication arrives right on schedule. Your reflection has sensed the threat to his existence." The other Thomas lunged forward, grabbing for the coin. Thomas twisted away, keeping it out of reach. Rebecca pulled Ellie back as the 2 identical men struggled. "You can't have them back," the reflection snarled. "I earned them. I paid for them." "That's exactly the problem," Thomas replied, shoving him away. "They're not things to be bought." As they fought, Thomas became aware of changes in the reflected world around them. The edges of the room were growing less distinct, objects beginning to blur into one another. The reflection was collapsing in on itself, accelerated by the presence of two versions of the same person. "Give them the coin now," Charles called out. "The reflection is destabilizing." Thomas managed to break away from his doppelganger. He tossed the coin to Rebecca, who caught it reflexively. "Think of home," he shouted. "Now!" Rebecca grabbed Ellie's hand, pressing the coin between their palms. The other Thomas howled in fury, lunging toward them, but it was too late. A golden light enveloped mother and daughter, growing in intensity until Thomas had to shield his eyes. When the light faded, Rebecca and Ellie were gone. In their place was a shimmering portal in the air, like a vertical pond reflecting the real world beyond. "No!" the other Thomas screamed. His form was beginning to waver, becoming transparent in places, solid in others. "What have you done?" "Restored the balance," Thomas said quietly. Charles approached the portal, peering through it. "Your family has returned to the real world," he confirmed. "The transaction is complete." He turned to Thomas with something like respect in his uncanny eyes. "You surprise me, Thomas Mercer. You have the courage to make such a sacrifice." "It wasn't courage," Thomas said. "It was love." The room around them was deteriorating rapidly now, furniture melting into floors, walls dissolving into ceilings. The other Thomas had fallen to his knees, his form flickering like a faulty hologram. "What happens now?" Thomas asked, watching as his reflection began to disintegrate. "Now?" Charles gestured to the collapsing world around them. "Now everything here fades, including you, unless what?" Charles pointed to the portal. "The way remains open, but only for a moment. You could still go through, rejoin your family." Thomas frowned. "But you said someone had to stay to maintain the balance." "I did," Charles agreed. "But I never specified who that someone must be." He straightened his impeccable tie. "I've played this game for centuries, Thomas. Perhaps it's time for someone else to take my place." Understanding dawned on Thomas. "You want to be free." Charles's perfect composure slipped slightly, revealing a flash of ancient weariness. "I want to rest. Every dealer eventually tires of the game." The other Thomas had almost completely vanished now, his form reduced to occasional flickers of translucent light. The portal was shrinking, the edges drawing inward. "Decide quickly," Charles urged. "The choice is yours, but not for much longer." The portal continued to contract, the edges folding inward like a closing iris. Through it, Thomas could see glimpses of his real home, solid, vibrant, alive with color and definition. He could make out Rebecca and Ellie standing in the living room, looking disoriented but whole. Thomas turned to Charles, who watched him with an unreadable expression. "If I go through, you stay here. Forever?" "Nothing is forever," Charles replied. "This reflection will eventually dissolve completely, taking me with it. But yes, long enough to balance the scales." The structure around them was disintegrating more rapidly now. Pieces of ceiling vanished into mist, walls became transparent, then disappeared entirely. Only the floor beneath their feet and a small bubble of stability around the portal remained intact. Thomas stepped toward the portal, then hesitated. "Why offer me this chance? Why not simply trap me here as planned?" Charles's perfect features softened slightly. "Because you did what no one else has done in all my years of offering the gold. You recognized your mistake before it was too late, and you were willing to pay the price to correct it." He gestured toward the shrinking portal. "Such wisdom deserves reward." A tremor ran through the remaining floor. Thomas stumbled, nearly falling into the void that had replaced much of the room. The portal was now barely large enough for a person to squeeze through. "Go!" Charles urged. "There's no time left for philosophy." Thomas looked once more at the dealer in his perfect suit, standing calmly amid the dissolution of reality. Then he turned and dove through the portal, just as it contracted to the size of a dinner plate. The transition was even more disorienting than before. A moment of crushing pressure, of existence compressed to a single point, then sudden expansion as he tumbled onto his living room floor. The portal snapped shut behind him with a sound like a thunderclap. Where it had been, the air shimmered briefly, then settled back to normal. Tom! Rebecca rushed to his side, helping him to his feet. Her touch was solid, warm, real. "You're here. You're really here." Ellie threw her arms around his waist. "Daddy, you came back." Thomas embraced them both, breathing in their scents, feeling the texture of their hair, the warmth of their bodies. "I'm home," he whispered, his voice breaking. "We're all home." Over the next few days, they discovered the changes to their world. The wealth remained, the paid-off mortgage, the investments, even the luxury car in the garage. But the other alterations had reversed. Ellie's freckles had returned, along with her boisterous laughter and endless questions. Rebecca's wedding ring was back on her finger, where she insisted it had always been. The family photographs showed all three of them, exactly as Thomas remembered. His father's pocket watch ticked steadily once more, though the inscription had changed yet again. It now read, "To measure love, not gold." Only one thing remained from the reflection: Charles Fielding's velvet pouch, empty now of coins but still carrying a residual warmth. Thomas kept it in his pocket as a reminder, a tangible connection to what had nearly been lost. A week after their return, Thomas visited the pond again. The water was no longer mirror-still. Small waves rippled across its surface, stirred by a gentle breeze. Thomas skipped a stone. 7 skips, a personal best. In the final skip's ripples, just for a moment, he thought he saw Charles Fielding's face looking up at him from beneath the water. The dealer raised his hand in what might have been a salute or a farewell, then dissolved as the ripples settled. Thomas reached into his pocket, feeling the empty velvet pouch. Then he withdrew his father's watch, checking the time. He had promised to take Ellie to the park and Rebecca to dinner afterward, ordinary activities that now felt like precious gifts. As he walked home, Thomas reflected on what remained after his encounter with the devil's gold. The material gains. Yes, he wouldn't pretend the financial security wasn't welcome. But more importantly, he'd gained a profound understanding of value, of what could and couldn't be measured in gold or dollars or stocks. Rebecca noticed the change in him. "You seem lighter," she observed one evening as they sat on the porch swing, watching Ellie play in the yard. "More present somehow." Thomas squeezed her hand. "I am. I nearly lost everything that matters by chasing things that don't." Rebecca looked puzzled. "You've been saying things like that since last week. Did something happen that I don't remember?" Thomas smiled, watching his daughter chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. "Let's just say I had a moment of clarity, a reflection that showed me what really counts." Later that night, as Thomas was turning off lights before bed, he caught a glimpse of himself in the hallway mirror. For just an instant, he thought he saw Charles Fielding standing behind his reflection, immaculate as ever in his midnight blue suit. But when Thomas turned, there was no one there. He faced the mirror again. "Is this how it works now?" he asked quietly. "You watch from the reflections?" The mirror showed only Thomas, alone in the hallway. But as he turned away, he thought he heard a distant voice, as if carried on the edge of a dream. "Someone always watches, Thomas Mercer. Remember that when you're tempted by gold." Thomas nodded, more to himself than to the empty hallway. "I will," he promised. Then he switched off the light and went to join his family, his real, whole, imperfectly perfect family, knowing that some treasures, once nearly lost, are never taken for granted again. Soft, intimate tone. "The shadows have receded. For now, thank you for journeying with me into the darkness. These stories only live when shared with souls brave enough to listen. If you felt that chill down your spine, that's your sign to join our community of shadow seekers. Subscribe now to ensure you never miss the next tale waiting in the dark. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have done if faced with this nightmare? Your reactions feed the stories I tell. And if you found value in tonight's offering, remember that a simple like is the coin you leave at my doorstep. Though unlike the handman's gold, this exchange brings only good fortune. Until next time, keep one eye on the shadows. "They're always watching," whispered. "They're always listening."